So when I was given this topic, given the time of year, the first person that I thought of was this guy. This is Ebenezer Scrooge. He is stingy, mean, and he does not want to give away anything. So you're all probably familiar with the Charles Dickens Christmas Carol, and what you probably don't know that it really is a parable for estate planning. So let's tell the tale. Scrooge is visited Christmas Eve by his recently deceased business partner, Jacob Marley. And Marley is weighted down by chains and locks. And he tells Scrooge, "These chains and locks were forged out of the estate taxes that my heirs had to pay because I did not do any estate planning." And Scrooge says, "Bah, humbug. I don't want to do any gifting, and even if I did, I certainly wouldn't want to use my exemption." So Marley reviews the rules with Scrooge. Rachel's already reviewed, sort of the big picture. What I'm going to focus in on is how to make gifts and do estate planning without using any of your exemption. As David mentioned, each person has the ability to give $15,000 a year to a recipient. Gift tax-free, doesn't use up your exemption at all. And that renews annually. That's why it's called the annual exclusion. In addition, as long as the donor pays expenses directly to the provider for medical or educational expenses, that's unlimited, and it doesn't count towards your exemption, and it doesn't count towards your annual exclusion. You can also leave unlimited amounts to a spouse or give to that spouse, but that doesn't really get you anywhere. If anything, you're just sort of deferring taxes. And lastly, of course, charitable deductions. Unlimited amounts can be given gift tax-free. So Connecticut has the same rules, and as does similar rules for the federal generation skipping taxes. So Marley tells Scrooge he's going to be visited by 3 spirits that will help Scrooge learn how to make his gifts. So the first spirit is the ghost of Christmas past. So this ghost takes Scrooge back in time. And so we learn of Scrooge's very sad childhood, his beloved sister's death, his amazing boss, Mr. Fezziwig, and his wife, and they have a great time, but I'm not going to talk about them. What I want to talk about is Belle. Belle was Scrooge's fiance, and she broke up with him because he was so mean and stingy and miserly. But what Scrooge sees when he goes back in time is that Belle has married and has lots of children. She has a large, happy family. So what if Scrooge had stayed with Belle and he had all those kiddos, maybe even grandchildren? How can we help him make gifts to all those people? First, the easiest thing is just to make outright gifts to them. It's simple, it's easy for clients to understand, using his and Belle's annual exclusions. You don't need a lawyer, and if you have a minor child or grandchild, you can make that gift through a Uniform Transfers to Minors Act account, or, as David was talking about, through 529 accounts. The issue with Uniform Transfers and Minor Acts accounts is, again, they're very simple, they're easy, you don't need a lawyer, but I cannot tell you the number of times, and all of my colleagues have, I'm sure, have had the same situation where we get donor regret. Not that they made the gifts, but that their kid is about to turn 21 and they're not ready to get those assets. And if, as I'm about to show you, sort of are consistent in the gifting, there can be a lot of money in those accounts. And once someone turns 21, they have to get it. There's really no option. I mean, there's workarounds, but in fact, here in Connecticut, if you can set up a trust before age 21 to put the money into it, but you do have to give notice to that beneficiary. I'll get to some alternatives later. Now, annual exclusion gifts, it's not real sexy, it's just very simple, but in spite of that, it's actually very powerful. Let's assume, and I have in this example, there's 9 recipients. So it's not necessarily only for big families like Belle and Scrooge's families. If you think about it, you can have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, even maybe spouses of those people. So let's assume there are 9 recipients and we have a married couple, and they make annual exclusion gifts to these 9 recipients. Right off the bat, because it doesn't use exemption, we've saved about 50% on the dollar in estate taxes. So that's like an assumed combined federal and state estate tax rate. And so if the parents decided to consistently do this over 20 years, even with 0 growth in the assets, we'd be saving about $2.7 million in estate tax. If you just assume a modest 6% return, the savings are over $5 million, getting all that future growth and that out of your estate without using any exemption. And if the family is inclined to also pay for medical and educational expenses, this is even more impressive. Also, what's nice about annual gifts like this is you can always stop, right? You can always just throttle it and say, that's enough. You're not overcommitted to any sort of plan. So the next spirit that visits Scrooge is the ghost of Christmas Present. And they visit the Cratchit family, who also have a lot of children. And Scrooge wants to help them, but he's concerned. He thinks they're too young. They're not experienced with having money because the Cratchits live a very modest lifestyle. Tiny Tim is too sick to receive outright gifts. So we recommend the use of trusts. The biggest benefit to trust is because the trust owns the property, not the beneficiaries, we can provide a lot of asset protection and management for these beneficiaries. So, it serves as both a force field against what we call predators and creditors, so divorcing spouses or lawsuits or people that might, have undue influence on the beneficiary. And it also protects assets for the beneficiary themselves. So, maybe they do have special needs like Tiny Tim. And so we want to make sure we do protect things by making the gift in trust. Maybe someone just doesn't have the ability or the maturity to invest assets for themselves. So we want to have some sort of formal professional asset management. And one thing for you guys to look at when you're looking at gifting to your kids or even in a will and estate plan is that the key to this working as asset protection is to not have that language that we call HEMS, health, education, maintenance, and support. That looks really nice in the document, but in fact, it's death to asset protection if you see that language. So oftentimes, the type of planning we can do when we review documents is say, that should come out because otherwise you're not going to get the asset protection you want. Now, whenever I watch, or actually I've actually read this story, The Christmas Carol, I'm always surprised. I'm like, oh, right, Fred. Fred is Scrooge's nephew. And Fred does not want anything from Scrooge. He doesn't want any of his money. He just wants to make something of himself. And so he and Scrooge talk about Scrooge lending money to Fred. And this is the topic of intra-family loans. So this is like a classic estate freeze, right? So the parent will lend money to the child and receive in exchange a promissory note. And that promissory note is set at the minimum required interest rates, which I've illustrated down there for the different terms of the notes. And the reason why it's a freeze is the parent is always going to get back the promissory note, the amount of the loan, plus a fixed interest rate. But if the child then goes ahead and invests those assets and they grow, any of that future growth will not be included on the parent's balance sheet. You do have to charge at least the applicable federal rate, what we also call like hurdle rates. So as long as you do better than these minimum rates, it can work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this technique other than to remind everyone that it's important when setting up this transaction or any transaction that your client respect the transaction and the plan that they've set up. Because if you don't have the discipline, follow the discipline and the formalities of the arrangement, there's a really good chance the IRS is not going to respect it either. So part of the due diligence and some of the things you can help your clients with is if there is an outstanding note or any kind of plan like the ones I'm going to talk about, a GRAT or a QPRT, make sure that they're following what they're supposed to do. And if you're not sure what to do, give us a call and we'll help you get everyone back on the path. So the last spirit visits Scrooge. This is the spirit of Christmas future. And he shows Scrooge his own death. He's going to die alone and unloved. But, if we flip forward to the end of the story, we learn that Scrooge, in fact, does live. And based on that premise, I've got two more techniques that are premised on the assumption that a grantor is going to live for a period of time. The first is called a Grantor Retained Annuity Trust, also known as a GRAT. A grantor contributes property to a trust and retains back a large annuity. The annuity continues for the term of the trust, whatever term the grantor selects, and is roughly equal to whatever the grantor put in plus the IRS 75/20 rate, which we often call a hurdle rate. So because the grantor has retained basically what he gave away, any performance of the asset in excess of that hurdle rate is going to pass either to outright or to a trust for his beneficiaries, but there's no gift tax because the grantor's retained almost all of it back. The gift is practically zero. So this is often easier to understand with an example. Let's assume Scrooge gave $2 million of property to a 2-year GRAT this month. And the hurdle rate this month is 3.6%. So you can see that in the first year, Scrooge is going to receive an annuity of $960,000, and in the second year, about $1.152,000. Assuming that the asset performs with 6% growth and 3% income, it's going to outperform the hurdle rate, and $181,000 is going to be left at the end of the term, gift tax free. The key thing here, though, is that Scrooge needs to survive the term he selects, and that's basically it. It's a great technique. So usually clients typically will go 2 to 5 years with these, but I've also seen slightly longer ones. Now, this one's kind of a cheat. The Qualified Personal Residence Trust does use up exemption, but it's at a discount, so Scrooge still likes it. With this technique, the grantor transfers a residence, similar to the GRAT. It transfers a residence to an irrevocable trust and retains the right to live and use the residence for a term of years. At the end of the term, it goes to or in trust for beneficiaries. Because the grantor has retained this right and we get a discount on the value of the house that's transferred. It's discounted because you have to subtract the value of what the grantor retained, and then there's certain actuarial calculations that go into this. So the discount's based on the grantor's life, the term of the QPRT, and the interest rate at the time. So for example, let's say Scrooge gifts a $10 million home to a QPRT, 20-year QPRT, and the 75/20 rate is 3.6%, and the home will appreciate at 4%. So the taxable gift in this example is a little over $2 million. There is no gift tax actually paid because we're going to be below the Connecticut amount, and then the potential tax savings, assuming the house appreciates, is about almost $10 million. Couple of caveats to how QPRTs work, and this is true for GRATs. The first thing, which is also true for GRATs, is in order to be successful, the grantor needs to survive the term selected. Now for QPRTs, if the grantor still wants to use the house, they have to rent it for fair market value. Also, if they've given a house that's appreciated over time, eventually there might be built-in capital gains in there that are going to either have to be paid by the grantor or the beneficiaries, and you want to sort of build that into the potential savings. I also think in practice, this tends to work better for a second home, a vacation home that the family is intending to keep. Because I definitely, when these QPRTs end, I get a little, if it's the grantor's primary residence, they don't really think about it, but when it comes time to start paying rent, they're not happy about it. To conclude, our sweet holiday tale, Scrooge wakes up Christmas Day, realizes the error of his ways, decides he's going to call his Cummings and Lockwood lawyer and fully invest and update his estate plan and start making annual gifts. And everybody's happy. And Scrooge is really happy because even in spite of all the gifting he's done, he hasn't used up any of his exemption. He's going to keep them. To which we estate planners say, bah humbug. Thank you.